Religion was never meant to unite humanity. It was meant to divide and control. Now go and strike Amalek and devote to destruction all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill, both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. Fear. That's what religion does to us. Fear. Fear of punishment, fear of questioning, fear of disobedience. And where there is fear, there is control. Because if we fear, we obey. If we fear, we worship. If we fear, we bow to someone else's power. This is how the Anunnaki control humanity through religion. But this is not just a theory. This is history. In this video, I will show you scientific and historical evidence from ancient texts, archaeology, and recorded history, so you can see the truth for yourself. Because the facts have always been there. You just weren't meant to find them. And once you see them, you can never unsee them. Once you take this path, there is no turning back, because knowledge is a door that only opens one way. Are you ready to step through? The word religion comes from the Latin term religare, which means to bind or to tie back. They told us that religion was meant to reconnect us with the divine, but that was a lie. Religion does not liberate, it binds, it controls, it enslaves. Instead of bringing us closer to true divinity, religion has severed our connection with it. Instead of expanding our consciousness, it has narrowed our perception. They have removed the divine from religion and replaced it with obedience. Religion was never meant to unite humanity. It was meant to divide and control. This is not an accident. It is not a misunderstanding. It is by design. From the very beginning, the gods demanded absolute obedience. They did not offer wisdom freely, nor did they encourage independence. They ruled with an iron hand, establishing laws, demanding sacrifice, and instilling a deep and unshakable fear in those who dared question their authority. The earliest civilizations did not arise from enlightenment or from some natural human progression toward order and knowledge. They were shaped, structured, and controlled by those who declared themselves divine, and the first commandment was always the same: worship, obey, fear. And if you do not, then you would suffer the consequences. This pattern is not unique to any one culture or time period. It repeats itself throughout history because it is the foundation upon which all religious and political systems were built. A civilization cannot be controlled if its people are united. They must be divided. They must be conditioned to fear one another, to see outsiders as enemies, and to blindly trust those who claim to speak for God. This is the essence of divide and conquer. Set one faction against another. Create differences where there are none. Turn men against their brothers, and they will never turn against their rulers. This is how kings, priests, and emperors have always maintained power. And this strategy was not invented by men. It was handed down by those who ruled before them. From the first written texts of Sumer to the modern world, we see the same unbreakable cycle. The gods chose their representatives on earth, elevating them above the common man and granting them the authority to rule. These chosen rulers were not necessarily wise, nor were they just. They were simply obedient. They understood the system, and they enforced it with unwavering devotion. The earliest city-states were not democracies, they were theocracies. The king was chosen by the gods, and his rule was absolute. The priest dictated laws, declared wars, and ensured that no one ever questioned the divine order. And what was this divine order? It was a hierarchy, a system where the gods ruled over kings, kings ruled over men, and men were little more than workers, soldiers, and worshippers. This was the blueprint that would be copied and expanded upon for millennia. Egypt followed it, declaring their pharaohs to be gods on earth, their power unquestionable. Babylon refined it, using religion not just to rule, but to justify war and conquest. The Hebrews took it further by eliminating all other gods and declaring that theirs was the one true power, making disobedience not just treason, but blasphemy. This was the true evolution of religious control. At first, there were many gods, and each city, each nation, had its own pantheon. This allowed for flexibility, but it also left room for doubt. If another city's god could rival your own, then perhaps your gods were not all powerful. This was a weakness in the system, one that had to be removed. Over time, polytheism gave way to monolatry, and monolatry gave way to monotheism. No longer were gods rulers of specific cities or peoples. Now, there was only one God, and he demanded everything. Worship was no longer a matter of tradition. It became law. To question was to sin. To sin was to be punished. And with this shift, the final level of control was achieved. The kings no longer needed to be gods themselves. They only needed to rule in the name of God. No longer did they need to prove their power. Now, their power was ordained. To rebel against a king was to rebel against the divine itself. This was the ultimate consolidation of control. What followed was bloodshed on an unimaginable scale. Wars no longer needed political motives. They were now holy. The Crusades, the Islamic conquests, the destruction of pagan traditions across Europe and the Americas, all were carried out in the name of God. But the gods did not descend from the heavens to fight these wars alone. They did not lead the armies or spill the blood by themselves. It was the wars of gods and men, manipulated and controlled, slaughtering one another for the glory of unseen rulers. And while the people fought, the priests and kings sat safely on their thrones, untouched, their power growing with every battle won and every enemy destroyed. Religion has never been about bringing people together. It has never been about elevating mankind. It has always been about submission. To submit is to obey, and to obey is to serve. But who are we serving? Those who sit in temples and palaces, those who write the laws and deliver the punishments, or something far older, something that has been pulling the strings since the very beginning? They tell us that religion was meant to reconnect us with the divine. This is the true meaning of the word religion, to reconnect us, that it was meant to guide us, to illuminate our path. But the reality is far different. Religion has severed our connection to the divine. It has locked us inside a system where we no longer seek truth. We accept doctrine. We no longer question. We submit. We no longer look beyond. We obey. They have removed the divine from religion and replaced it with fear. They have taken enlightenment and turned it into dogma. They have ensured that we do not rise. We kneel. Because religion was never meant to unite humanity. It was meant to divide and control. And all of this didn't start now. This beginning accompanied the dawn of civilization from the very start, where it all began, in ancient Sumer. Sumer was not just the first civilization, it was the first theocracy. Before Egypt, before Babylon, before Greece and Rome, there was Sumer, and it was here that the first gods did not merely reside in the heavens, they walked the earth. They ruled as kings, they demanded absolute servitude, and they established a system that would define human civilization for thousands of years to come. We are told that civilization began as a natural progression, hunters and gatherers settling into villages, growing crops, and slowly evolving into complex societies. But the evidence tells a different story. The Sumerians themselves did not claim to have built their civilization alone. They wrote in their earliest texts that their knowledge was given to them by the gods. The gods gave them law, kings, language, writing, and architecture. And above all else, the gods gave them order. an order built on servitude, submission, and absolute control. But these were not gods in the way we think of them today. They were not distant, abstract beings ruling from beyond the clouds. They were present. They had names, faces, homes, and temples. They were physical rulers, and they owned their creations. The earliest texts do not describe a world of divine guidance, but of divine rule. And like all rulers, these gods had an elite class of enforcers, those who ensured that the system remained in place. Ancient Mesopotamian government was built on the fundamental understanding that human beings were created to serve the gods. Society itself was structured as an extended household, where the king and the high priest acted as the fathers of civilization, responsible for their people in the same way a patriarch ruled his family. This was not symbolic. This was the literal framework of their political and religious system, a system in which the entire structure of civilization was modeled after divine authority. The king was not merely a political figure. He was appointed by the gods to enforce divine will on earth. He was the supreme administrator, the highest judge, the military commander, and the earthly representative of the gods who had granted him his rule. Below him were the priests and governors, who ensured that the people remained obedient and that the cities functioned according to religious law. The priesthood controlled the temples, the economy, and the distribution of wealth, while regional governors managed territories on behalf of the king. Beneath them were the scribes, judges, generals, and officials who administered daily affairs, collecting taxes, overseeing construction projects, and ensuring that divine order was maintained. And at the bottom of this hierarchy, the workers, the laborers, the soldiers, and the slaves, those who toiled under the weight of divine law, their lives dictated by a ruling class that claimed to act in the name of the gods. One of the most revealing documents regarding the divine nature of kingship in Mesopotamia is the Sumerian King List. This ancient text, first discovered in 1906 by the German-American scholar Hermann Hilprecht during excavations in Nippur, modern-day Iraq, is inscribed in Sumerian cuneiform and dates back to approximately 2100 BCE. Since its discovery, multiple versions of the King List have been found, each inscribed on clay tablets or stone prisms, all following a remarkably similar structure. The text itself is a record of kingship in Mesopotamia, listing rulers, the length of their reigns, and the cities they governed. But what makes it truly extraordinary is its claim that kingship did not emerge from human society, but was given to humanity by higher beings. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. This phrase is the key to understanding the origin of divine rule in ancient Sumer. In academic and university circles, scholars interpret this as evidence that the Sumerians believed kingship was divinely sanctioned, that rulers were chosen by the gods, blessed with authority, and tasked with maintaining cosmic order. According to this mainstream interpretation, the phrase does not imply a literal descent, but rather a metaphorical relationship between the divine and the ruling class. In this view, kings did not gain power through military conquest or political strategy alone. They ruled because the gods chose them. To challenge the king was to challenge the gods. To disobey was to defy the divine itself. But this is not the only possible interpretation of the text. While academia restricts itself to metaphorical readings, refusing to acknowledge any alternative meaning, the actual wording of the Sumerian King List makes a far bolder claim, one that is almost never openly discussed. It does not say that kingship was granted or ordained. It says that it descended from heaven. This is not a vague spiritual concept. It is a direct statement of origin. Something or someone came from above and established dominion over the earth. The text does not describe the gods as distant, formless deities. It lists them as actual rulers, reigning over cities before human dynasties even began. According to the King List, the earliest rulers were not human at all. The pre-flood kings, figures like Ululim and Dumuzid, are said to have reigned for tens of thousands of years, an impossibility if these were mortal men. Historians dismiss these figures as mythological, but why would the Sumerians, a civilization known for its meticulous record-keeping, list them in the same historical framework as later human rulers? If we take their words at face value, the implications are staggering. The gods ruled the earth before humans. They descended from the heavens, from the stars, from what modern terminology would call outer space. They established kingship not as a human institution, but as a system of control designed to keep humanity subservient. This is not speculation. This is what the texts state. And yet, modern academia refuses to acknowledge this perspective, choosing instead to sanitize ancient history into something comfortable, something explainable within the boundaries of conventional thought. But we do not have to rely on the interpretations of scholars who dismiss what is right in front of them. We have already explored this topic in depth in a 2023 video here on the channel, where we break down every detail of the Sumerian King List, its implications, and the timeline of when these beings arrived on Earth. If you want to see the full picture, the origins of religious control, I invite you to continue watching this video. And after watching, you can check out this earlier video for even more insights. According to this, the Sumerian King List, kingship was not something humans created. It was given to them by the gods. Rulers did not claim power through conquest or politics alone. They ruled because the gods chose them. To challenge the king was to challenge the gods. To disobey was to defy the divine itself. But who were these gods? Ancient Mesopotamian texts describe a pantheon of flesh and blood beings who descended to earth and established their dominion over mankind. The most powerful among them, the Anunnaki, were not distant creators but active rulers who controlled cities, dictated law, and demanded labor. They did not guide humanity. They owned it. The organization of this dominion was not left to chance. It was structured, deliberate, and absolute. One of the most revealing texts about this system of divine rule is the ancient Sumerian tablet known as Enki and the World Order. Discovered in 1905 in the ruins of Nippur, one of the most sacred Sumerian cities, the tablet was unearthed during excavations led by the University of Pennsylvania. This text, inscribed in Sumerian cuneiform, is estimated to have been written around 2100 BCE, during the Third Dynasty of Ur, though the myths it records are undoubtedly far older, passed down through centuries of oral tradition before being committed to clay. Unlike many ancient texts that focus on mythology or cosmic battles, this tablet is an administrative document, a record of how Enki organized the world and assigned dominion to various gods. It is a blueprint of how divine rule was established on Earth. According to the tablet, Enki was not merely a creator deity, he was a ruler, an architect of civilization. He did not oversee the world alone, but instead delegated power, ensuring that each god and goddess had a specific function. Some were given control over cities, others over rivers, mountains, or agriculture. He determined which deities would oversee war, trade, fertility, writing, and law, ensuring that every aspect of civilization was carefully managed. The document describes how Enki assigned responsibilities to the gods, structuring their domains like a vast empire where each deity played a role. But this was not an act of generosity. This was an act of control. The text makes it clear that this was not simply a divine act. It was a governing strategy. Enki's method of rule was not brute force or chaos. It was a meticulously designed system of bureaucratic efficiency. He understood that to maintain dominion over Earth, the gods needed structure, and so he implemented three fundamental principles. First, he established economic and territorial bonds between Sumer, its cities, and neighboring regions, ensuring that trade routes and resource distribution were controlled. Ur was designated as the central hub of commerce, with all wealth flowing through its port. Second, Enki created a structured administration, assigning specific gods and goddesses to oversee different aspects of civilization. This prevented chaos or competition among deities, ensuring that each had their place and that power remained consolidated. Enki's governance eliminated disorder and enforced strict oversight. Third, he placed a supreme overseer at the top of the system, ensuring that divine law was upheld without interference. To enforce order, Enki appointed Utu, Shamash, the sun god, as the ultimate enforcer of law and justice, the all-seeing eye, who would ensure that the system remained intact, that no power struggles disrupted the balance, and that all deities operated within their designated role. This was not the creation of a free world. This was the implementation of a hierarchical dominion. The gods did not operate independently. They were functionaries within a divine bureaucracy, and at the center of it all was Enki, overseeing everything. His decree was final, his organization absolute, and his rule unchallenged. The role of humanity within this system was not one of equality, nor of participation. It was servitude. To the Anunnaki, great gods of heaven and earth, I have given their divine powers, their great offices. To the gods of the cities, I have assigned their temples, their rights. To the black-headed people, humans, I have given the decrees of civilization, so they may work and toil in the service of the gods. The implications of this text cannot be overstated. It tells us that civilization was not a spontaneous development. It was an engineered system of control. The gods did not create humans for companionship or spiritual enlightenment. They created them for labor, for servitude, for obedience. Every aspect of life, from agriculture to law, from trade to warfare, was overseen by the gods, with humanity trapped at the bottom of the hierarchy. The gods had their domains, their responsibilities, and their privileges. Humans had only one duty: to serve. And this system was not temporary. It was designed to be eternal. The division of labor between the gods, the designation of territories, the hierarchy of power, it was all structured to ensure that divine rule could never be challenged. Even when the gods eventually withdrew from direct involvement in human affairs, the system they created remained intact. The kings took their place. The priesthood carried on their rituals, and the laws continued to govern society as if the gods had never left. What began as a divine order became a self-sustaining machine, in which humanity continued to toil under the laws and hierarchies established by the gods. This text is one of the clearest pieces of evidence that the Anunnaki were not mere myths, but rulers, administrators of the world, enforcers of law, and designers of civilization itself. And their influence did not disappear. It evolved. The idea of divine rule, the notion that kings and priests act on behalf of the gods, continued through every major civilization that followed. From Sumer to Babylon, from Egypt to Rome, from medieval Europe to modern religious institutions, the blueprint laid out in Enki and the World Order remains intact. There is much more to uncover about this text, and for that reason, we have an entire video dedicated to exploring Enki and the World Order in depth. In that video, we go through the tablet line by line, analyzing how the gods established dominion, how the Sumerians recorded these events, and what this means for the origins of religious control. The link to that video will be available at the end of this one. Make sure to watch it, because understanding this document is key to understanding how divine rule was established on Earth, and how it still affects us today. In 1876, archaeologists in modern-day Iraq discovered a series of ancient clay tablets dating back to approximately 1700 BCE. These tablets contained one of the oldest recorded myths of creation and divine rule, the Atrahasis Epic. Written in Akkadian cuneiform, this text provides a chilling revelation about the origins of humanity. Unlike the biblical account of creation, where God lovingly forms man from dust, the Atrahasis Epic tells a very different story. It reveals that humanity was not created out of divine benevolence, but as a labor force for the gods. When the gods, like men, bore the work and suffered the toil of the gods was great, the work was heavy, the distress was much, so they created man to bear the load. This was humanity's original purpose. They created mankind to serve them. The Sumerians did not view their existence as a divine gift. They saw themselves as the laborers of their gods, perpetually indebted, bound by duty, born to obey. And yet, this truth was never openly admitted. The gods were not foolish rulers. They understood that absolute tyranny creates rebellion. And so, the system was masked. The gods were not our owners, they were our protectors. They were not our oppressors. They were our saviors. They were not here to enslave us. They were here to give us purpose. And so, the great deception began. Obedience became faith. Submission became devotion. Slavery became worship. To keep this order intact, the gods built great temples, ziggurats, towering structures that dominated the landscape. These were not places of prayer. They were command centers. The first religious structures of human civilization were not places of worship in the way we understand them today. They were not built for communal prayer, for gatherings of the faithful, or for spiritual enlightenment. They were built for control. Long before churches, temples, or cathedrals, there stood the ziggurats, massive, towering structures that dominated the skyline of ancient Mesopotamian cities. These were not places for the people. They were fortresses of divine power, constructed not to invite worshippers in, but to keep them out. Each city-state operated as an independent kingdom, ruled under the divine protection of a specific patron deity. The ziggurat was not a public place of worship. It was the literal home of the god, an artificial mountain raised high above the city, where the deity was believed to dwell. These structures were not built for human gatherings or rituals, but as exclusive abodes for the divine, where only the highest-ranking priests were allowed access. The construction of ziggurats dates back to the Uruk period between 4100 and 2900 BCE, when the first great cities of Sumer were established. These massive structures, built in a series of stepped terraces, resembled sacred mountains, a concept possibly influenced by earlier highland cultures. The word ziggurat itself comes from the Akkadian zigguratum, meaning peak or pinnacle, while the Sumerians referred to them as unir, meaning high place. The function of these structures was clear: to elevate the gods' earthly dwelling closer to the heavens and, in doing so, elevate the priests who served them. Herodotus, the Greek historian, described the great ziggurat of Babylon, known as Etemenanki, the foundation of heaven and earth, as a place where the god Marduk himself would descend to sleep with a chosen woman. This temple had no statue of the god, only a sacred chamber where he was believed to manifest. This suggests that ziggurats were not symbolic monuments. They were thought to be literal meeting points between gods and men. The high priest or priestess, chosen to serve the deity, acted as the god's caretaker, ensuring that offerings were made, prayers were conducted, and that no mortal dared challenge the divine presence ruling over the city. Access to these sacred spaces was strictly limited. The towering staircases and massive platforms were not meant for public use. Only a select group of priests, the guardians of the divine, had the privilege of ascending the Ziggurat steps or entering the sanctified chambers. These priests wielded immense influence, as they were the only ones permitted to communicate with the gods, making them some of the most powerful figures in Mesopotamian society. They became the gatekeepers of divine will, controlling not only religious affairs, but also economic, legal, and political matters. The economic function of the Ziggurats further cemented their role as centers of control rather than places of worship. These towering structures were not just religious sites, they were administrative and economic hubs. Each ziggurat functioned as a storehouse where grain, silver, and other resources were gathered, distributed, and taxed. The priesthood managed this wealth, collecting tributes from the people and redistributing resources in the name of the gods. The people of Mesopotamia were required to pay offerings not just in devotion, but in mandatory taxation, a system that allowed the priesthood to accumulate vast wealth and power. One of the most remarkable pieces of evidence supporting this reality comes from the Gudea cylinders, two massive clay inscriptions discovered in 1877 in the ruins of the Sumerian city of Girsu. These cylinders, dated to around 2150 BCE, describe the construction of a great temple under the command of the god Ningirsu. But what is striking is not just the temple's construction, it is how the king was commanded to build it and how the people were forced to obey. The great temple was built according to the divine plan. The god gave the command and the king followed. The people labored, for this was their duty. It was the will of the gods. This was the core of religious rule in Sumer. The gods did not appear before the masses. They spoke through kings, through priests, through intermediaries who alone had the divine right to interpret and enforce their will. This was the beginning of absolute religious power, where questioning authority was not just rebellion, it was heresy, and thus the foundation was laid. The template for religious rule was perfected. Sumer was not just the birthplace of civilization, it was the birthplace of control. This system did not fade with time, it spread. As Babylon rose, as Assyria expanded, as Egypt flourished, as Rome conquered, the same model was replicated, refined, and expanded. The gods changed names, the rituals evolved, but the hierarchy remained untouched. The priesthood still dictated laws in the name of the divine. Kings still claimed to rule with divine authority. And the people? They still obeyed. The priest kings of Mesopotamia had set something into motion that could not be undone. The structure of power they created, where rulers were not merely political figures, but divine representatives on earth, became the foundation for every major empire that followed. These rulers understood something fundamental about control. Power was never enough on its own. A sword could cut down an enemy, but it could not rule over a nation. True control required more than force, it required belief. The people had to see their rulers not as conquerors, not as men, but as chosen by the gods themselves. Their word had to be more than law, it had to be divine decree. Babylon, Assyria, Egypt, Greece, and Rome all inherited this same fundamental system, shaping their civilizations around the idea that kings did not rule by strength alone, but by divine will. The rulers of Babylon claimed to act on behalf of Marduk, their laws carved in stone as divine commandments. The Assyrians went even further, declaring their conquests as holy wars, justified by the gods themselves, where bloodshed was not an act of ambition, but a sacred duty. The pharaohs of Egypt were not just kings, they were gods in the flesh, living deities who could not be questioned or defied. In Greece and Rome, the same model continued, with rulers tying themselves to the divine, claiming direct lineage from the gods, ensuring that their power could never be seen as merely mortal. The laws of these civilizations were not simply rules to maintain order. They were divinely sanctioned mandates. Every law, every punishment, every decree was enforced not just by kings and judges, but by the very will of the gods. To disobey was not merely to break the law, it was to rebel against the divine itself. And what awaited those who disobeyed? The wrath of the gods. Floods, plagues, war, and famine were all presented as punishments for those who defied divine order. The people were not ruled by the threat of earthly kings alone. They were ruled through fear of divine punishment, both in this life and beyond. This fear was the ultimate tool of control. It was not enough for a ruler to be feared. It was not enough for an army to be strong. The true power of a ruler came from making the people fear something greater than him, something invisible, something omnipotent, something inescapable. Kings could be overthrown, gods could not, and so religion was woven into the very fabric of society, ensuring that people obeyed not just out of duty, but out of terror. Fear was the foundation. Worship was submission. Obedience was survival. But over time, a flaw in this system began to emerge. The old world was filled with too many gods, too many rulers claiming divine favor, too many priesthoods competing for power. A Babylonian king could claim Marduk's blessing, but so could an Egyptian pharaoh with Amun-Ra, or a Roman emperor with Jupiter. This diversity of gods left too much room for doubt, too much room for defiance. If one god could be challenged by another, then perhaps none of them were truly all-powerful. And if the gods could be questioned, so could those who ruled in their name. This was a dangerous realization, one that threatened to unravel the entire structure of religious control. This had to change. And so, the gods were consolidated, the many became one. The transition from polytheism to monotheism was not a spiritual awakening, it was a power move. The old gods, with their conflicting domains and rival priesthoods, were merged into a single, all-encompassing deity, a god with no equals, no competition, no room for defiance. One nation, above all others, would lay the foundation for this new religious order, a people who would redefine the gods themselves. This was the final stage of religious control. Under polytheism, rulers still had to justify their divine favor, competing with rival gods and their priesthoods. But under monotheism, all divine authority was unified, and with it, the power of the rulers who claimed to speak on behalf of this one true God. No longer was kingship a matter of regional gods granting favor. Now, it was the will of the one God himself. This transformation did not happen overnight. It began with a single kingdom, a people who dared to rewrite the rules of the gods themselves, a people who went from many gods to one, a people who would build the foundation of what would become the greatest religious empire in history. The transition from polytheism to monolatry and finally to monotheism was not just a theological shift. It was the ultimate consolidation of power, a move that ensured total control over both the minds and the lives of entire populations. And it began with a man who emerged from the very heart of Mesopotamian civilization. His name was Abraham. The story of Abraham is more than just the tale of a man receiving divine revelations. It is the story of a transition, a pivotal moment when the religious structure of Mesopotamia began to evolve into something far more insidious. Abraham was born in Ur of the Chaldeans, a city where the polytheistic traditions of Sumer were deeply entrenched. The dominant deity of Ur was Nana, Sin, the moon god, whose towering ziggurat stood as a visible symbol of divine authority. This was the world Abraham was born into. A world ruled by many gods, a world where priesthoods dictated law, where kings justified their rule through divine sanction. But something changed. The Bible tells us that Abraham's father, Terah, took his family and left Ur, migrating toward Canaan. The reasons for this journey are unclear. Was it political instability, economic necessity, a divine calling? Whatever the cause, the movement took Abraham directly through the religious epicenter of Mesopotamian influence. First to Haran, another stronghold of the moon god Sin, and then further west into Canaan. Canaan was a land filled with many gods, many traditions, and many competing centers of religious power. It was here that the true transformation began, where the old gods of Mesopotamia began to be stripped away, and a new form of religious control was established. The Bible itself hints that Abraham did not immediately abandon polytheism. He and his ancestors had once worshipped other gods, but a process had begun, a gradual shift away from polytheism, an evolution that would redefine religious history. The first step was monolatry, the exclusive worship of a single god without denying the existence of others. Abraham's God was not yet presented as the only God, but he was the one Abraham and his descendants were commanded to serve. This was a revolutionary shift in religious thought. It did not yet impose a universal doctrine on all people, but it did create a central figure of worship, a God who demanded exclusive loyalty. At this stage, Abraham's God was still El, the Canaanite high god, often referred to as El Elyon, God Most High, El Olam, everlasting God, and El Shaddai, God of the mountain. He was not yet called Yahweh. That name would emerge later. At this point, Abraham's God was one among many, but he was being elevated, his name modified, his traits expanded, his dominion broadened. He was becoming something new, something that would soon erase all others. As Abraham traveled, he built altars in Shechem, Bethel, and Mamre, sites already associated with Canaanite religious traditions, but now rebranded in the name of his God. The monolatry of Abraham was a stepping stone, a way to move away from polytheism without immediately destroying the religious framework of the past. But monolatry was still imperfect. The existence of other gods still implied that power could be shared, that divine authority could be divided. This was a weakness in the system, one that had to be removed. If you want to better understand the relationship between Abraham and the Anunnaki, there is an entire video on this topic here on the channel. I'll leave a link to it on the end screen. The final transformation came with Moses and the introduction of absolute monotheism. The Hebrew God was no longer one of many, nor simply the greatest among them. He was now the only God. All others were declared false, non-existent. The old gods were not just ignored, they were erased, demonized, cast as idols or lies. No longer could divine power be divided. Now, there was only one absolute authority. With this transformation, the power structure of religion was perfected. No longer could kings and priests invoke different gods to justify their rule. Now, there was only one divine authority. No longer could rival temples or priesthoods challenge each other. Now, there was only one absolute doctrine. And most importantly, no longer could people seek alternative paths to the divine. Now, questioning was forbidden. Doubt was rebellion. And rebellion meant suffering, not just in this life, but for all eternity. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam took this system to its final stage. No longer did rulers need to declare themselves gods as the pharaohs of Egypt once did. No longer did kings need to justify their rule with signs and wonders. Now, they ruled in the name of the one true God. This was an even stronger position than before. Kings could die, but God was eternal. A mortal ruler could be questioned, but divine law was beyond challenge. This shift eliminated competition entirely. It forced entire populations to submit to a single religious authority, with no alternatives, no rivals, and no possibility of escape. No longer did rulers need to claim divine power for themselves. Now, they only had to act in the name of the divine. The pharaohs had once called themselves gods, but now, kings and emperors became something even more dangerous, earthly representatives of an unseen, unquestionable authority. This was the true shift in power, a system where rulers no longer needed to prove themselves. Divine legitimacy was now inherited, passed through bloodlines and royal families. Kings no longer needed to perform miracles or command armies personally. Now, their power was simply assumed, written into law, and justified by divine decree. But why was royal blood so sacred? Why was it so carefully preserved, protected, and passed down? Across civilizations, from the Egyptian pharaohs to the medieval kings of Europe, the idea persisted that rulers were more than human, that their blood carried something unique. In Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon, kings traced their ancestry directly to the gods. The Merovingian dynasty of medieval France was rumored to descend from divine beings, their sang real, royal blood, later becoming the legend of the Holy Grail. Even today, royal families intermarry, preserving an unbroken lineage that has endured for thousands of years. Could it be that the rulers of ancient civilizations were not just claiming divine favor, but were actual descendants of the gods? Could their insistence on pure bloodlines, arranged marriages, and strict genealogies be more than just tradition? Was it a way to preserve something ancient, something that was not meant to mix with ordinary humans? And if that was true, then what of those who were not part of these sacred bloodlines? Were they merely subjects or something more dangerous? Outsiders who could disrupt the system? Throughout history, those who questioned royal legitimacy, those who dared challenge divine rulers, were not just seen as traitors. They were labeled heretics. But could there be something more? Something hidden beneath the surface of religious dogma and royal decrees? The idea of the divine right to rule did not emerge from nowhere. For thousands of years, royal bloodlines have been protected, carefully preserved, and passed down through generations. Why? Why was it so vital to maintain the purity of royal blood? Why was it believed that kings were not just chosen by God, but different from ordinary men? Across the world, from the pharaohs of Egypt to the emperors of China, from medieval European monarchs to the rulers of ancient Mesopotamia, there was a common belief that royalty carried something unique in their veins, that their blood was sacred, divine, untouchable, that they were not simply appointed by the gods but descended from them. This belief persists even today, buried beneath layers of history and myth. Legends of the sangue real, the royal blood, the Holy Grail, speak of a lineage that traces back not to ordinary humans, but to something greater. Some say it was the bloodline of Christ. Others claim it was the bloodline of the gods themselves, the Anunnaki. Could it be that the rulers of the ancient world were not merely humans who claimed divine favor, but the actual descendants of celestial beings? Could the insistence on royal bloodlines, the obsession with genealogies, arranged marriages, and dynastic continuity be more than just tradition? Was it a way to preserve something ancient, something not meant to be diluted by common blood? The Anunnaki no longer needed to rule openly. There was no need for gods to walk the earth, no need for direct intervention. The control structure they created was now self-sustaining. Kings, priests, and emperors became the new gods on earth, enforcing the system on behalf of their unseen masters. An invisible ruler at the top, human puppets below, and beneath them, a population bound by obedience, submission, and fear. The pharaohs of Egypt had once claimed to be divine, but even as Egyptian civilization faded, the blueprint remained intact. The Roman emperors, who had once demanded worship, now ruled under the blessing of the Christian God. The church and the state merged into a single force, each reinforcing the other, ensuring that power remained unchallenged. In Europe, the medieval kings ruled under the doctrine of the divine right of kings, a principle that stated that their authority came not from the people, but from God himself. It was no longer about personal power, it was about divine destiny. This doctrine spread across the world, shaping empires and defining the fate of civilizations. The Chinese emperors ruled under the mandate of heaven, a belief that as long as an emperor governed justly, the heavens would favor him. The Islamic caliphates established religious law as the foundation of governance, ensuring that no ruler could be questioned without challenging the word of God. Even in Japan, the emperor was considered the direct descendant of the gods, an unbroken lineage that justified absolute rule. The popes, too, became kings in all but name. The Vatican was not just a religious institution, it was a seat of power, a kingdom disguised as a church. The Pope was declared the supreme authority over Christian rulers, granting or revoking divine legitimacy at will. Kings bowed before him, emperors sought his approval, and those who dared defy him often met their end in blood and fire. The system had reached perfection. It was no longer about gods ruling openly, it was about men ruling in their name. And so, the Anunnaki control structure evolved into its final form. No longer did the gods need to descend from the heavens to enforce their rule. They had created a system so powerful, so deeply ingrained into human civilization, that it no longer required their presence. The kings, priests, and religious elites became the new gods on earth, their authority beyond question, their power eternal. And the people? They still obey. For centuries, religion has been the most powerful weapon ever wielded. It has justified conquest, slaughter, and unspeakable atrocities, not in the name of kings or empires, but in the name of God himself. Religious wars were never truly about faith. They were a tool, one that kept empires expanding and populations in check. From the battlefields of the Old Testament to the Crusades and the Inquisition, holy war served one purpose: ensuring the cycle of obedience and bloodshed never ended. But war itself was never the true objective. The real goal was the perpetual cycle of conflict, a world where faith was used to justify slaughter, and where the blood spilled on the battlefield only strengthened the very rulers who orchestrated it all. And so, the strategy of divide and conquer was perfected, not just through politics, not just through kingdoms, but through holy war. The first wars in history were not fought for wealth alone. They were fought for the gods. Sumerians slaughtered Akkadians in the name of Enlil. Babylonians waged war under the banner of Marduk. Egyptian pharaohs led armies with the blessing of Amun-Ra. Religion was not a tool of peace. It was a tool of war, a justification for endless conquest. But these wars were only the beginning. The bloodiest conflicts had yet to come. The Old Testament is filled with tales of divinely sanctioned warfare, where Yahweh commands the Hebrews to annihilate entire nations, sparing no one, not even the children. The Quran, too, speaks of holy struggle, justifying violence in the name of faith. The Crusades saw Christians and Muslims butcher each other for control of lands they both considered sacred. The Inquisition hunted down heretics, burning them alive for daring to question the official doctrine. In every case, the justification was the same: God demands it. But was it truly God who demanded these wars? Or was it the priesthoods, the kings, the unseen rulers who stood to gain? When warriors marched into battle, they believed they were fighting for heaven. But heaven did not bleed. The priests did not fight. The kings did not die on the battlefield. It was always the people who paid the price. sacrificing themselves for wars they did not start, for causes they did not understand. The truth is, holy war was never about serving God. It was never about righteousness, salvation, or divine justice. It was about control. Keep the population fighting amongst themselves, and they will never question the ones who control them. Keep them blinded by faith, consumed by hate, and they will never see the hands pulling the strings from above. And so, the blood continues to flow. The wars rage on. The people suffer. And the ones who started it all, they remain in power, just as they always have. And the greatest trick of all, these wars never truly ended. Even today, the world is consumed by religious conflict. Nations go to war in the name of faith. Terrorists slaughter innocents, convinced they are serving a divine cause. Governments use religion to justify their conquests, their genocides, their oppressions. And through it all, the rulers remain untouched, watching, waiting, profiting. For thousands of years, humanity has lived under an illusion, the illusion of divine authority. We have been told that the gods rule us, that our kings and leaders are chosen by heaven, that the wars we fight and the sacrifices we make are justified by the will of the divine. But now, after unraveling the layers of deception, after tracing the origins of religious control back to its source, one undeniable truth remains. The gods of the past were interpreted as gods, and even here we use this term. But in the sense that we interpret this word, they were never gods at all. They were rulers. They were the architects of civilization, the enforcers of hierarchy, the masters of control. Their dominion did not end when they vanished from the historical record. Their system remained intact. It was passed down through kings, priests, and emperors, through popes and sultans, through monarchs and presidents. It adapted, it evolved, but it never disappeared. The same forces that ruled in ancient Sumer still rule today. They rule through governments, shaping laws and economies that keep the masses in servitude. They rule through religion, using faith to bind people to an invisible master. They rule through fear, ensuring that obedience is maintained, not through open force but through belief. This is the ultimate prison, the prison of the mind. But every prison has a key, and the first step to breaking free is seeing the cage for what it is. Knowledge is the key. Understanding where this system came from, how it was built, and why it still persists is the only way to dismantle it. The chains that bind humanity are not made of iron, they are made of belief. For centuries, we have been taught that submission is righteousness, that obedience is virtue, that suffering is holy. But these are not spiritual truths, they are mechanisms of control. Yet, before we break free, we must ask, were the Anunnaki truly evil? Or is this simply our limited human interpretation? The concept of good and evil did not exist in the same rigid way before monotheism. When one god became the only god, a paradox emerged. If he was purely good, where did evil come from? The solution was to separate the two. God became the force of light, while evil was cast outside of him into something else. But in the ancient world, before this separation, the gods were neither fully good nor fully evil. They simply acted. And when the Anunnaki came to Earth, they did not just impose control, they created life as we know it. If it were not for their intervention, we would not even exist. They descended from the stars, altering the genetic material already present on this planet. They shaped humanity, guiding our evolution, transforming us from primitive beings into intelligent creators, thinkers, and builders. They did not just rule us, they taught us. Without them, there would be no civilization. They taught us to write, to speak, to count the stars. They gave us the foundation of law, architecture, medicine, and science. They taught us how to cultivate the land, how to construct great cities, how to harness fire and metal. And beyond survival, they gifted us with the finer things in life: music, art, poetry, and the joy of creation. They showed us how to tell stories, how to express ourselves, how to celebrate life itself. If some Anunnaki sought control, others sought to elevate us. If Enlil imposed strict rule, Enki gave us knowledge. If some saw us only as laborers, others saw us as their legacy. Ningishida, the god of wisdom and transformation, is linked to ancient teachings of alchemy, esoteric knowledge, and hidden truths. Perhaps they did not simply rule us. Perhaps, in their own way, they loved us. This idea is not so different from what the ancient Gnostics believed. In 1945, a set of ancient texts known as the Nag Hammadi Scrolls was discovered in Egypt, scriptures that had been hidden for centuries, containing secret knowledge that challenged everything we thought we knew about creation. The Gnostics, early seekers of spiritual truth, believed that the God worshipped by mainstream religion was not the true creator, but an impostor. They called him Saklas, the fool, also known as the demiurge. He was not a being of pure light, but a deceiver who broke away from the higher realms and, in his arrogance, created the material world, not as an act of love, but as an act of enslavement. The Gospel of Judas, one of the most revealing Gnostic texts, describes how this false god set himself up as the one true creator, demanding worship, obedience, and sacrifice. Does this sound familiar? It should, because this is the same pattern of control we have seen since the beginning of civilization. The Gnostics understood that this world was never meant to be paradise. It was designed to be a prison. The rulers of this world, both earthly and cosmic, do not seek our enlightenment. They seek our servitude. But here is the most important truth. Not all gods sought to enslave. If the false god Saklas is the deceiver, then there must be a real divine source beyond this illusion. And if we strip away the layers of dogma, we find that this idea is present in nearly every ancient spiritual tradition. Yes, religion has been used as a tool of control, but spirituality itself is not the enemy. If we go beyond the dogma, beyond the blind worship, we can still connect with the true divine. We can feel the presence of the real creator, the source of all spirit. This knowledge has never been fully erased. It has survived in ancient wisdom traditions, in mystical teachings, in esoteric schools hidden beneath the surface of religious institutions. It is the same enlightenment the Gnostics spoke of, the same awakening sought by the alchemists, the same transformation taught in the mystery schools of old. And perhaps it is the same knowledge the Anunnaki once gave to us. Because if we study them, not just as rulers but as teachers, we begin to see a different path. A path toward evolution, self-realization, and enlightenment. Because we are like them. We are descendants of the gods, both physically and spiritually. We are not meant to be slaves. We are meant to awaken, to evolve, to reclaim the divine spark that has been buried within us. This is the true path to liberation. Not blind faith, not submission, but knowledge. The Anunnaki built civilization, but they are not its final architects. We are. We will rise. We will awaken. We will reclaim what was hidden from us. And we will return to the source, the true divine force beyond this illusion. Namaste.